will be discussing the following topics, and for now I will be focusing on a little bit about the history of the technique and the technology and some of the basics of Doppler flow velocity. And when I'm talking about the basics, a really short overview of the real basics of it, it is sound. And in particularly for ultrasound flow velocity or ultrasound imaging, we're talking about the sound in this range, in the megahertz range, because most of the preclinical and clinical research ultrasound probes will be in the 3 to 20, maybe even 40 megahertz ultrasound range. But where did it all start off with when we started talking about Doppler flow velocity measurements? It started off with the Austrian Christian Doppler. In 1842, he described the principle of the Doppler effect because he was an astrologer and he observed a color shift change in a binary star that he was observing. And during a boat trip, he saw the waves that the boat was making and the compression of the waves during the boat transition through the water. And based on that principle, he later on formulated the Doppler effect. A few years later, there was a Dutch student of Christophe Ballot who wanted to disprove this theory in first instance in 1845 by using a train with a singular sounds and observed the sounds pre, during, and passing the observer. And he found out that he was wrong and that Doppler was right, because at the time that the train was coming towards the observer, the sound was higher, the frequency of the sound was higher. During the passing of the train, it was the actual frequency that the train was transmitting at that time. And when the train passed, the sound frequency was actually lower than the sound that the train was making at that time, thereby clearly describing an all-day effect that we all actually know of, the Doppler effect, as well as police and firemen sirens on fast traveling cars. But now we come to the math, because basically the original basic mathematical formula for the Doppler flow, for the Doppler principle, is that here you have the moving frequency and the observer frequency multiplied by the frequency of the waveform that is displacing. And in Doppler's case, this was light, and in our case, this will be sound. In our case, we're not talking about this formula, but we're talking about the Doppler flow velocity formula, where we have a transducer, our ultrasound probe, sending out the ultrasound, bouncing it off of this moving blood cell, and catching the refractive frequency. So that would generate us, giving us the following formula, where here the twofold is the reason of the back and forth traveling of the sound. And another important focus point is the cosine theta. And this specific focus on this formula will be continued on during the presentation a little bit later. But now a general overview of the ultrasound in the preclinical and clinical research field. It all started basically when ultrasound was being used to detect defects in casted metal in the early 1920s. This was done by using piezoelectric crystals transmitting ultrasound through a metal block. And due to shifts in the sound, they were able to detect the level of flaw within the metal. At a certain point, scientists started using these same piezoelectric crystals on animals and humans to image the movement of components in the body. And basically, this was the first very robust, simple M-mode imaging that most people right now probably are familiar with ultrasound imaging technology. And it's kind of started off when Adler and Hertz did their work at the Lund University. Later on, this was standardized by Harvey Feigenbaum in the US for clinical practice, But also during that same time interval in Osaka, Satomura used ultrasound to measure the Doppler effect. Later on, with advances in technology and computational abilities, fabrication technology, 2D ultrasound was created, now commonly known as the B mode. Added on the Doppler principle and measurement capacity. A long time, color Doppler was developed. And even at present time, there is a large focus on using the increase in the computational power of our systems to use the data that is already there with measuring ultrasound to get even more information out of it. But why is ultrasound so interesting for us? As Martin already mentioned, ultrasound is a non-invasive method to investigate. And in this instance, often I have heard people talking about, I'm going to do a Doppler. What they were actually using a physics term to describe doing a flow velocity measurement in their preclinical or clinical subjects. Here you just see a general overview of echo imaging of ultrasound and a wave spectrogram of a Doppler flow velocity measurement. Another key point of interest that is of high importance for preclinical research is that basically you need a much higher ultrasound frequency to investigate your preclinical research animals, because most research is done in mice or rodents, which are relatively smaller and have way smaller structures than in humans. So you need a much higher resolution to get a proper image. Here you see the effect of high frequency and low frequency. With the high frequency, you will have a very good resolution. However, the penetration depth is lower, thereby not seeing this third spot. While with a low frequency, the ultrasound can travel further into the body, whilst you will have a less discernibility. So there is a clear balance between depth and resolution when using ultrasound imaging. And that also translates to Doppler flow velocity measurements. So now we go back to the formula that we previously shown. And here we will talk about the focus of the importance of the angle in the flow velocity formula to calculate this flow velocity. Why is this so important? Basically, when comparing normally with echocardiography measurements, you will clearly see that you get the best image of, for instance, here the carotid artery, when you have it at a perfect 90-degree angle. And there you can see a nice image of the carotid artery. However, to do a flow velocity measurement, you would prefer to do it at as sharp as possible angle. And I will explain that in a little bit why that is the case. Here you can see a Doppler flow velocity probe showing you the wave spectrograph of the flow velocity in the right carotid artery. And here is the indication of the angle of the measurement. So why is this so important? Here is basically a schematic representation of what I just showed you. You have the probe sending out the ultrasound, reflecting off of the blood cells, coming back, giving you a wave spectrograph, giving you thereby a flow velocity measurement. And as indicated, this is a relatively steep, sharp angle of about 15 degrees. But why is this angle so important in this formula? I will have to take you back to your middle school, where most people will definitely recognize this graph. And the importance here is basically what I mentioned previously with echo measurements. You would always image at a 90-degree angle. What does a 90-degree angle in cosine mean? It's 0. at a 0-degree angle would actually be the most ideal angle to measure flow velocity, because a cosine of 0 is actually comparable to 1. So in the formula, the angle will not have an effect in your calculations. To show this in more detail, we presume a certain set of conditions where C, the velocity of sound in soft tissue, is 1540 meters per second, which is a generalized accepted standard. Your Doppler shift is about 20 kilohertz, and your transmission frequency and the probe was originally 20 megahertz. We will take the angle as the variable input, and we will calculate the flow velocity. So applying this with the angle correction, you would get for these conditions that at 0 degrees, your flow velocity would be 0.75 meters per second, while at an angle of almost 90 degrees, you would have an infinite flow velocity, which of course is ludicrous. To better illustrate this at different degrees, I'm showing you this graph, where you can clearly see that with an increasing angle, you will get a higher calculated flow velocity. But what does that mean with a practical setting? Because this is often a practical setting when you're doing a flow velocity measurement. Here you can see that ultrasound imaging probes are relatively large, and it is quite difficult to get them positioned in such a way, the mouse and the probe, that the angle is as small as possible to decrease your angle effect in your measurement. Because in the previous image, you could clearly see that the angle effect would start off skyrocketing approximately past 60 degrees. But looking at this graph, you can clearly see that from 0 to 60, there is already a steep increase in the flow velocity calculations. From 0 to 60 degrees, there is basically, excuse me, a twofold increase in the calculated flow velocity. To further highlight, we're taking this graph in two sections, where you can see the increase in flow velocity from 0 to 20 degrees and the increase in flow velocity from 40 to 60 degrees, which is often seen as the operating range when using an echocardiograph system. Here you can clearly see that each degree, and literally each degree, will have a much larger effect on the calculated flow velocity in the range between 40 to 60 degrees than that it would have between 0 and 20 degrees. So as a very important take-home message for this would definitely be that if you want to have a more accurate measurement, you would best achieve this through measuring at a smaller angle. So to achieve consistency and accuracy for your research data, you would definitely require a proper angle correction, and if possible, do this at as sharp as possible angle. And now we'll transition back to Martin to give him the chance to raise another audience poll with you.
All right, thanks, Nikki, and thanks for that introduction and the first part of your presentation. Now that Nikki has sort of finished that segment talking about angle correction, we'd like to ask you, the audience, the following question. So how important do you feel angle correction is while performing Doppler flow velocity measurements? Do you feel it's very important and you always try to enter angle as accurately as possible? Perhaps you feel it's somewhat important and you're aware that it can have a potential impact on your data. Some of you might think it's not too important and perhaps don't routinely pay too much attention to angle correction. And the last option being perhaps you haven't given it much thought until today and you're unsure. Okay. Continue to give you a few moments to continue casting your votes. And interestingly, as the results are being collated, about 30% of our audience really hadn't given it much thought until today. So that's an interesting result. And with that said, Nikki, we'll let you continue on with your presentation.
Thank you, Martin. And now, indeed, we're going to go to the second section of our talk. And we're going to talk about the use of the Doppler principle for different preclinical systems and ultrasound versus laser. And the first one will not be about Doppler. Here you can see what we were just talking about, using a ultrasound flow velocity measurement by applying the pulse Doppler technique to do a velocity measurement. But there is also another option to use ultrasound to do a flow measurement. And here it is being depicted, and you can see that it's basically using ultrasound, a refraction on a solid surface, as indicated here, and being captured, and as well a second beam being sent back, reflected and being captured. And by basically measuring the transition time, you will be able to calculate a flow through this measurement area. And based on that, with this technology, you're able to do a flow measurement in milliliters per minute, for instance, in units. However, this technique has to be done through a invasive, or at least a minimum invasive manner, where you basically hook the artery of interest and then do your flow velocity measurement. And I say flow velocity measurement because basically the blood will flow through, ultrasound will refract through the measurement angles, and based on that, there will be a calculation, and it will give you an amount of blood flow through that specific artery during that measurement time. Whilst on the right side, you will have a non-invasive Doppler flow velocity probe measuring flow velocity in a non-invasive way. Both will have basically an assumption on the composition of the blood and the composition of the artery, or in the old Doppler flow velocities, even an assumption on the composition of the body. And that will be have to be kept in mind. Now going towards the next section is basically laser Doppler flow velocity measurement. Key here is basically that laser will give you a better resolution than ultrasound will. But as mentioned previously, with the higher and lower frequency in ultrasound, same thing yields for laser. It's a very high frequency. But due to this very high frequency, the penetration depth, as shown in this graph here, even at different wavelengths, will peak at about 1 millimeter of depth. So basically there are two options to use laser Doppler flow velocity measurements. One is using basically a fiber directly on your target of interest, where you then measure the flow velocity within this measurable area within your 1 millimeter from the tip of your probe. Or you're using a larger system where you're basically beaming the laser on a certain surface area and then capturing with a high resolution camera the refractive light, and thereby you get basically these two cases where you have a point laser Doppler flow velocity measurement, or you have an overview of Doppler flow velocity measurement where you see an overview of the flow, the microvasculature flow, either being high or low in this case. So the take-home message here is basically laser Doppler will have a higher resolution, but its penetration depth is less. So be aware of when using this technology, what specifically you're using it for to obtain the data. And last but not least is the other Doppler measurements in the ultrasound ecosystem, namely being color flow Doppler measurements and power Doppler measurements. And the distinction between the two is very basically that in the color Doppler measurements, you will get a directional indication, where often the acronym BART is used, with blue meaning away and red meaning towards your measurement. So you will be able to distinguish flow direction of the blood in the 2D image that you're imaging at that time, whilst power Doppler does not have the advantage of highlighting flow direction. It just highlights flow, so basically movement within the 2D imaging plane. But because it is not highlighting and distinguishing between a specific direction, it will have a much higher resolution and sensitivity compared to the color Doppler. And as a commercial intermezzo, I would like to point out that Scintica has the availability to supply you with both ultrasound and laser imaging and flow velocity options. Now back to our topics of discussion. So basically, now we're going to talk about what can you do with these Doppler flow velocity measurements? What do you need to consider when using such a system? As well as some highlights for publishing applications using blood flow velocity measurements. We will be talking about basically applications of Doppler flow velocity in a non-invasive approach, and we'll be finishing off on one invasive approach using Doppler cuff probes. But now, why are we even using Doppler flow velocity measurements? Because here you can see a Doppler flow velocity measurement at the intersection between the left ventricle aortic outflow and the mitral valve. You can beautifully see the ECG sequence here between the R peaks, one full systolic and diastolic flow, where you have the peak flow velocity during the systole and the E and A peaks during the diastole. But why is Doppler flow velocity so interesting? Well, it's basically because of this. Here you can see an overview of how body weight can be translated in an allometric equation to give you an idea of heart weight, left ventricle volume, stroke volume, based on your body weight. And here on the complete right, it is being used as 25 grams, which is basically an average small young mouse. But I want you to specifically focus on the last three parameters, because these last three parameters are body weight independent. And what that basically means is that it doesn't matter if it's a mouse or an elephant or a human. It's very comparable to have arterial pressure, aortic velocity, and pulse wave velocity to be comparable between these species. So that means that measures of these three are almost directly translatable from a mouse to a human. And that definitely adds value to your measurements. These are spectrograph waveforms of Doppler flow velocity measurements at different sites in a mouse. As you can see here, this is the carotid flow velocity measurement that I previously shown with comparing an ultrasound probe with a Doppler flow velocity probe measurement angle, as well as different points in the aortic arch, a renal flow, as well as the coronary flow. This one will be discussed later as well. So now we will focus on systolic functional parameters that you can obtain with a flow velocity measurement. Here you see a quite common observable echograph of the left ventricle. And we want to do a flow velocity measurement of the systolic capabilities. And what that means is that we basically want to measure the flow velocity at the aortic outflow tract at the ventricle leaflets. And here you can see it pointed. When compared to the heart, you would basically be pointing it like this. But what would you see? This is basically what the average spectrogram would look like of a flow velocity determination of the aortic outflow tract. And how do I know that I'm looking at the aortic outflow tract? It's basically due to these small peaks downwards. because you can see between the RR peaks, we're definitely in the systolic phase, as well as this negative flow is due to the closing of the valves, creating basically a back suction, creating a negative flow at my measurement location, clearly indicating that I am measuring at the valve of the aortic outflow tract of the left ventricle. So now doing this measurement, how much data can I get out of this? Of course, you will get the maximum flow velocity measurement. But if you combine it with the ECG measurement, you will be able to get much more information out of it, like a pre-ejection timing, the time it takes to rise to the maximum flow velocity, the mean flow velocity, as well as the stroke distance. Why is it so interesting to do a Doppler flow velocity measurement of the left ventricle? Well, basically, this technique is non-invasive and repeatable. While the gold standard in the field to measure left ventricle capacity is doing a pressure catheter measurement, which unfortunately is invasive and a terminal measurement. But how do those two techniques stack up to each other? Here you see basically in a mouse that has been catheterized, as well as a fixed Doppler flow velocity measurement signal measured simultaneously. And you can clearly see that these waveforms overlap beautifully combined with the ECG signal. And if you then derive these further in the first derivative, you will get the following information. And then you can plot these data against each other. And if you do so for the peak aortic acceleration as well as the mean aortic acceleration, you will see that there is a very strong correlation between these two data points, which basically means that you have the option to substantially increase your intra-measurement intervals in your animals by using a non-invasive, non-lethal Doppler flow velocity measurement compared to the terminal pressure catheter measurements. And you will be able to longer track disease development in your coronary models. Now we will switch back to the measurement of the diastolic functional parameters. What that basically means when an ultrasound Doppler flow velocity measurement is going from the aortic valve outflow, just a slight nudge to the right, to the mitral valve where the blood flows into the left ventricle. And doing the flow velocity measurement there, you will get the following spectrogram, where you can clearly see that looking at the RR interval, that these E and A peaks are during the diastolic phase. And this is basically the remnant of the negative flow generated due to systolic contraction. This information will allow you to generate the following data, where the most interesting and most reported factors are undoubtedly the E over A peak ratios, as well as the myocardial performance index, because the measurement will include part of the systolic flow velocity that you will have, allowing you to assess the isovolumic contraction time as well as the relaxation time. And then you have, of course, the E and A peaks. I know, of course, that you're thinking you will need to have a good separation because E and A peaks tend to fuse quite easily with the increased heart rates, especially in mice, but that is definitely possible. So to sum up, for cardiac functional Doppler measures, systolic functional measurements to assess peak flow velocity are an option to add on to your left ventricle pressure measurements to get more data, or see it as a functional alternative measure. For the diastolic functional measures, it's very interesting to know that you have the option to do E over A peak ratio measures, as well as determining the MPI. Now, we're going to go into the next section, but prior to that, we will do a short audience poll again, and I will give back the word to Martin.
Okay, thanks, Nikki, and thanks for that introduction to some of the applications and the overview of the cardiac systolic and diastolic parameters that can be measured with Doppler flow velocity. I also want to briefly mention that there is a white paper available that talks about the use of aortic flow velocity as a surrogate to DPDT, which is the gold standard, as Nikki mentioned. We'd be more than happy to provide that to anyone that's interested. Okay, our third poll, before Nikki continues on talking specifically about some applications for Doppler flow velocity, we want to know which of the following models you use in your research. And the options are the transverse aortic constriction model, the TAC model, for developing hypertrophy and heart failure. Nikki will talk about this. Do you do research with diseases that affect arterial stiffness and compliance, aging, atherosclerosis, for example? Does your research look into coronary diseases or disorders affecting coronary flow? None of the above. You plan to in the future is the fourth option. And then the last one is does not apply. We have about 60% of our audience voted, so we'll just give you all a few more moments. I'll take this opportunity also just to remind you, we will be running a Q&A question and answer session at the end of Nikki's talk. So please do submit your questions via the question and answer dialog box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the talk. Okay, very good. I think at this point, Nikki, I will close this poll, and I'll ask you to continue on with your presentation. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Martin. And as mentioned, we'll be continuing on with some of the models Martin just mentioned, such as the Trans-Eor constriction banding model. Well, basically, this banding results in preclinical models for cardiac hypertrophy. And how are they normally generated? Is by creating a stenosis in the aorta. This is often used with suture wire and a 27G needle, making a tight knot around the aorta, or using the O-ring methods that has been reported last year by Melby et al. So basically what you create is indeed a stenosis site leading from this normal blood flow indication to a blood flow indication where there is an increased flow velocity towards the right carotid artery, while there is a decreased flow towards the left carotid and even sometimes the left clavicle. And this is due to that at the stenosis site, the flow velocity is increased so much that it basically bypasses these two arteries. But how do we know this? We can assess flow velocity at the stenosis site quite easily. And you can then use a simplified Bernoulli's equation to get an idea of what the pressure drop is basically at this site based on the flow velocity measurement. But if you use an alternative approach, you might be able to do this measurement directly after or even during the stenosis forming operation when you're using the suture wire, is by measuring the flow velocity in the carotid arteries, both the left and the right carotid. This will allow you to determine a ratio between the left and the right carotid arteries. This would basically look like this. Then you would have a pre-band and a post-band measure where you can clearly see a decrease in flow velocity in the left carotid artery and an increase in flow velocity towards the right carotid artery, as well as an increase in flow velocity at the stenosis site. However, what if the situation is like this, where you have a tight and a loose band? Where you have loose bands, you do see the change, but the pressure change is not as much or as burdensome for the heart as it is during a tight constriction. So this means that you will basically have differential effects of your surgical model, and you will not be able to properly stratify your cohort if you only assume that you applied your stenosis, and that the stenosis will always be the same. So in other words, basically by doing a Doppler flow velocity measurement at both the stenosis side as well as the left and the right carotids, you will be able to immediately or very early on be able to view the severity of your stenosis, as well as estimate the disease development. And this will help you in better stratifying your obtained data after your experiments. Now we will focus on other research application with the Doppler flow velocity measurement, which is basically the pulse wave velocity measurement. But why would you measure pulse wave velocity? This, as mentioned previously, is a body weight independent factor. However, this body weight independent factor gives you a indication of the atrial condition, especially in disease models and with aging. The arteries stiffen. And what this basically means is that with stiffening of the arteries, it becomes more difficult to pump the blood through without the elasticity of the artery compensating for these pressure changes during every heartbeat. So what does this affect and how it is measured? Basically, to do a proper pulse wave velocity measurement, you need to measure at two different locations. You measure, for instance, in the human situation, you measure the flow velocity in the right carotid, as well as in the femoral artery. By measuring the distance between these two and the displacement waveform, the time from in the ECG signal, which I will show you in a little bit, you will be able to calculate the pulse wave velocity. But why is it so important that it is even being considered or is said to be an independent predictor of cardiovascular risk? Well, basically, the stiffer your arteries are, the higher your systolic pressure is and slightly lower your diastolic pressure. And basically, you're just jet flowing your blood through your arteries, and your vasculature bed will be damaged to this in the long time, as well as thereby leading to damage to your organs. But basically, how do you measure blood flow velocity, pulse wave velocity in preclinical setting? In the preclinical setting, we have the added advantage that the animals are very small and that you could even measure in the same blood vessel instead of measuring at bifurcations in the human situation, the carotid and the femoral. You can measure, for instance, at the aortic arch and at the abdominal aorta. And here you see the ECG signal R peak at the aortic arch and the abdominal aorta flow velocity. And you will clearly see a distance between these two peaks. And this is what is important in the pulse wave velocity measurement. So there are basically two ways to assess pulse wave velocity. In a sequential way, where you are dependent on your R peaks to do the timing, as well as a simultaneous method. Important part in the sequential measure is that you are really dependent on your R peaks. And of course, in animals such as mice, which have a heart rate of 400 beats per minute, a lot of things can change from measuring at one location and then shifting towards the next location. So as an overview, this is the sequential measurement option, where you do the measurement at the aortic arch first and then set up and do the measurement at the abdominal aorta, and then use the ECG signal to determine the time difference between the wavefront and the R peak, and then calculate the distance between your two measurement locations to get an assessment of the flow pulse wave velocity. In a simultaneous measure, you basically have two probes simultaneously measuring the flow velocity in your cardiovascular system. And there you get basically such a spectrogram waveform, where on the top is the aortic arch and on the bottom, the abdominal aortic signal. And then you can visualize much clearer the waveform dissociation between the two distances. And the most beautiful thing of this is that it's not ECG dependent. and thereby you will not be affected by potential changes between your measurements locations and the need to shift between the two. And you can even do drug testing in such settings. To give you a short view of how it is achieved, here you can see clearly the aortic abdominal signal. And now the researcher here is trying to acquire the aortic arch signal, which will come up in a few seconds. Here you beautifully see the aortic arch signal. And there you have quite quickly a pulse wave velocity measurement. So now we will continue on with peripheral blood flow measurements, because we have focused a lot on what you can obtain with systolic and diastolic functional measurements and two mainly used research models. But what is the value of measuring flow velocity at the periphery? For that, we would like to focus on the aorta and the blood flow through the aorta when it just leaves out of the heart all the way to the abdominal aorta. You can clearly see that here there is no bump, and the further you come distal from the heart, basically you can see the increase in flow velocity during the diastolic phase. But what does that mean? That gives you the opportunity to do a calculation to assess the pulsatility index and the resistivity index. And this will give you an idea of what the vasculature bed past your point of measurement is giving you as a resistance for the blood flow. So if you have artery narrowing in your microvasculature, you will see an increase in your resistivity index. And that will mean that there are problems with your microvasculature post these measurement locations. And for the final non-invasive parameter that can be assessed is the coronary flow reserve. Why would you measure the coronary flow reserve? Is basically because in the clinical setting, it is often seen as an indicator for investigating coronary artery problems, as well as to see if there is an improvement in your coronary arteries. Because coronary flow reserve is basically just an indicator of your exercise capacity in a certain sense, because the bigger your arteries are able to increase means there is more potential to provide your blood to the heart itself during its diastolic phase. And I say the diastolic phase because here you can see a spectrogram of the flow velocity of the coronary artery, here specifically the left main artery, during the diastolic phase, because the heart is being provided blood during the diastolic phase and not the systolic phase. And why is it so difficult in a preclinical setting to measure this flow velocity? Is basically because the artery bed on the heart is literally that, on the heart, on the thing that is beating continuously and moving around. So with an echo, it is slightly more difficult to find the right imaging plane to fix on that specific location to do a Doppler flow velocity measurement. Whilst if you use a dedicated system, you will be able to better approach this left main artery to do a flow velocity measurement. But note that you definitely require the use of ECG to assess that you're looking at the right flow velocity. As can be shown here, acquiring the coronary flow is relatively easy. Where you can clearly see the flow velocity coming up during the diastolic phase, as you can see here. So now we'll round off with the only invasive application of Doppler flow velocity assessments with the use of Doppler cuff probes, which will actually be a cliffhanger because Professor Jeanette Willard has agreed to do a webinar on January the 28th in 2020, and it will be a talk about the use of Doppler flowmetry to investigate the hemodynamic effects of anti-cancer therapies. Basically, she will, in part of her talk, will talk about the use of Doppler flow velocity probes that she puts around arteries of different vasculature beds, like the renal, the mesenteric arteries, as well as the hindquarters, to investigate the effects of drug administration to her rat model, where she has shown very clearly that one drug can affect the blood flow towards different organs in a different manner. And this will have a severe impact on how best to use the drugs in the future. And I hope all of you will tune in to this in January. So thank you very much for your attention. And now we will be starting our Q&A session. So please type in your questions, and I will be giving back the word to Martin to hear what questions have already come up.
Excellent. Thank you, Nikki, for that really informative talk. And I think we're right on schedule. We have about 10 minutes to answer some questions that our audience has. So again, I'll encourage everyone in attendance to please submit your questions through the Q&A. I'll give Nikki a moment to catch his breath and also maybe glance through some of the questions. Before doing so, and while doing so, I'm just going to ask two very quick questions of you and our audience. Number one, we'd like to know who amongst you are planning to be at the American Heart Association scientific sessions, which are being held in Philadelphia later this week. If you could just take a moment to answer this question, yes or no. And while you're doing that, we'll just perhaps start with our first question. So Nikki, this comes up frequently, I'm sure, but how do you control for angle error using Doppler without an image to guide you? And perhaps you talked about it, but maybe just elaborate on that.
Thank you for the question who asked it. Yes, the angle correction when you're using basically a one-dimensional imaging of the Doppler flow velocity is basically you don't, unless you really know the angle that you're approaching at. And I say I don't is very contradictory to explaining and very focusing on the angle correction of being of very much importance when using Doppler flow velocity. But that is basically with the use of a dedicated Doppler flow velocity system, you would have probes that are very small and allow you to approach your measurement direction in a very sharp angle. So an angle where you're at 15 degrees or even less. For instance, when doing a flow velocity measurement of the aortic outflow, you would approach through the apex and you were literally at a near 0 degree angle of the flow velocity measurement. So you're basically at the point, the most ideal point of measuring your flow velocity. So there is no need, no strict need to do an angle correction. And even if you're off by a few degrees, the effect on the calculated flow velocity will be negligible compared to the effect that you would have if you would be able to do an angle correction in an image at where you're imaging at between 40 to 60 degrees, where every degree will approximately increase your margin of error about 1% per missed degree in your angle correction. So you don't do the angle correction, but you damn well make sure that you're measuring at a point as in line with the direction of flow as possible.
Okay. And we are making the slide deck available to all of you as well. So you can refer back to some of the earlier slides that Nikki presented where it clearly shows in that 0 to 15 degree range, the effect of the angle has a minimal impact on the resulting velocity calculations, whereas it has a much larger impact as those angles are increased. Nikki, how you mentioned that you know, high frequency ultrasound is important for preclinical research. What are the operating frequencies of the Doppler flow velocity probes or the system that you described today?
Yes, for the system, for our system that we have at Scintica is basically the system from Indus Instruments. And it has two Doppler flow velocity probes, one at 10 megahertz and one at 20 megahertz, which basically gives you the opportunity to use it on both on rats and mice, where with 20 megahertz, you have an approximate penetration depth of about 1 centimeter, whilst at 10 megahertz, your penetration depth is definitely further, about twice as much. However, there will be a restriction in the resolution of the waveform that you will get. But it definitely, for a mouse, 1 centimeter is deep enough. And for a rat on the right angle of approach, you will definitely get still good flow velocity data that you will require or want to obtain to assess your cardiovascular condition.
Okay. I'm scanning through the questions here and also through some of the comments. David had asked if there's any literature or documentation we have to better understand the angle issue. We actually do also have a technical note that talks about the effect of the angle on the measurement. So David will be sure to make that available to you. And if anybody else is interested, we can send that along too. Nikki, how do you know what artery or valve you are sort of measuring from or obtaining the spectrogram from without an image?
Yes, that's basically a good question, and also often a concern of researchers when they are choosing between using an ultrasound echo system where you can see what you're doing versus a dedicated system is basically you do know where you're angling your probe at. You have a depth setting. So you basically know approximately where you're looking at when you're using your probe. And the other thing is the spectrographs that I've shown previously are very distinct. So you will have distinct waveforms for specific arteries. For instance, very clearly the aorta has a very distinct waveform. And this distinct waveform gives you an indication of where you're looking at. Similar to the arteries, where you can, for instance, here view how the artery looks like, what you may not previously. We'll go quickly out of presenter mode and hopefully switch back to the right location where you get an overview of the arteries. So there we were, where you basically see clear, distinct spectrograph waveforms that allow you to identify where you're looking at. For instance, if you're looking for a new artery where you do not already know what the spectrograph waveform should approximately look like, you would indeed need to open up the animal first, then approach the artery where you would approach it when it would be a closed animal and get an image of the spectrogram. And as soon as you're able to identify this spectrogram and the location of how you're imaging, you will be able to actually image any and every artery that you would like, as long as it is large enough and has substantial blood flow coming through it that is above the diastolic flow that is remaining like here.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. And I think that is the take-home message, isn't it? Is that flow through each of these vessels has a very distinct profile. And once you know what to look for, you can feel confident that you're measuring from the appropriate location.
Mm-hmm. I saw here also an interesting question coming up. Basically, the question is it possible to study pulmonary artery flow in rats? Then the question is simply answered by yes, because it's very nice to know that in rats and mice, the pulmonary artery flow can be measured with the ecosystem as well as the Doppler flow velocity system, because basically the flow direction is from roughly set the sternum upwards into the pulmonary arteries. So to do a proper flow velocity measurement, you're basically imaging almost straight on to the sternum, but then of course on the pulmonary artery, and there you're able to achieve pulmonary artery flow velocity measurements. And the person who asked this question, we will provide you with a application note from a collaborator in the US who has, I think, recently published some of the results on artery flow velocity measurements through the pulmonary artery using a flow velocity specific system.
Okay, indeed. Nikki, I'm just browsing through some of these other questions. I don't know if you have an opportunity to do the same. So yeah, pulmonary artery flow in rats, we've answered that. Okay. And so is ECG mandatory for acquiring Doppler spectrogram? It's come up a few times in some of the questions that we have here. What are the
As I
advantages of having an ECG or
mentioned,
not?
definitely an advantage if you want to acquire more data from the waveforms. As I said, it is important for identifying a few specific waveforms, such as the coronary flow. Although the coronary flow spectrogram is, of course, quite unique in its own way, but you get more data out of having an ECG signal. So a combination with the ECG signal is not mandatory, though definitely advised. And the only one, the measurement where I don't really care is pulse wave velocity measurement, because even with the pulse wave velocity measurement, I don't even care about the angle of the probe that I'm measuring, because I'm specifically focusing on the transition of the wave front between the two measurements. So this is for me almost one of the most favorite measurements, because this is the really dirty measurement, which gives you a very beautiful data, almost student proof in a certain sense.
Okay. We're just at we're just over the 1 hour mark. I don't know, Nikki, should we maybe ask one more question and then we'll save the rest for answering after the fact?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So I guess at the end of the day, what cardiovascular pathologies, in your opinion, are best assessed with Doppler? I mean, I guess you've talked about it, but maybe you can just summarize and recap.
Which cardiovascular pathologies? Basically, any and every pathology that would show a different response on your vasculature with regards to arterial condition, in the sense that you would suspect a change in pressure or flow velocity, you would be able to pick up, as well as in cardiac condition. For systolic and diastolic flow velocity measurements, it's definitely possible. So there is no specific cardiac condition that I would definitely exclude.
Okay.
Only the ones that are in the microvasculature, because we're talking about ultrasound imaging. Like I said, if you need to use the right tool for the right application, and for microvasculature, I would definitely advise you to use laser Doppler approach, because there the imaging resolution is much better, as well as ultrasound just basically skims through the microvasculature and goes for the bigger signals.
Mm-hmm.
So the only cardiovasculature category that you would not be able to approach would be the microvasculature. The rest you would be able to get an indication of effects if the effect is strong enough to affect the flow velocity.
Okay, perfect. Well, Nikki, let's stop there, and I'll just reiterate and mention once again that this webinar has been recorded. We will make the slide deck available. A few people have asked how they will gain access to that. You'll all receive an email within the next 24 to 48 hours with a link to access these resources. I also want to briefly mention that Scintica will be at the American Heart Association meeting, booth number 1124. We'll have some product on display, echo ultrasound, this Doppler flow velocity system that Nikki highlighted today, some other equipment for cardiac research as well, including implantable telemetry. So please stop by our booth 1124 if you are at the AHA. So with that, I'd like to thank Nikki for his presentation today. I'm sure you're all leaving today's session with a new appreciation for the Doppler technique and its use in preclinical research, and perhaps also some questions to ask yourself when considering the best equipment to use for your experimental protocols. Please do reach out at any point in time to Nikki or to Scintica with questions. We'd be happy to talk about your particular application. And also, as Nikki mentioned, look out for some information about our upcoming January 28th, 2020 webinar with our guest presenter, Dr. Willard from University of Nottingham. So thanks to Nikki, and thank you all for taking the time out of your day to attend our session, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And Nikki, thanks again.
Thank you as well, and thank you everybody for attending this session, and I hope you took home at least one thing to learn and use for your research.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day, everyone.